Hi everyone and welcome to the lecture on IEPs for English language learners. So earlier on in the semester we talked about the components of IEPs, the present levels of academic performance, measurable goals, services, participation in the general ed curriculum, progress monitoring, participation in statewide assessments, and transition. So it's important to think about the perspectives that we need to when we're working with English language learners and their families, because we want to make sure that what we're doing is culturally and linguistically responsive. So some things I think it's important to note is for when you're compiling an IEP and thinking about present levels of academic performance, one of the things you really want to think about is including what the present levels of their English language proficiency is, both at home and school, because they may very well be different. When we think about measurable goals, this unit will be talking about developing SMART goals. It's important to include academic, functional, and language goals and the short-term perspective. So it's not just special education goals, but it's how do you incorporate those goals and also include language-based goals when you're thinking about what SMART goals are appropriate for a particular student. When we think about services, it's important to use evidence-based practices for English language learners, and those evidence-based practices may very well and are often different from those used for non-ELL students. The location of services should be with their true peers as much as possible. And those true peers may be with students who are also English language learners, or they may be with true peers that are non-ELL learners. When we think about the general ed curriculum participation, we want to make sure that English language learners should receive continued development in English while continuing to receive special education services. And that instructions should include attention to the academic language development. And also that gen ed curriculum should be culturally responsive. When we think about progress monitoring, we want to make sure that we're reducing bias and increasing validity by including multiple sources that are designed for use for diverse learners. In the textbook, there are a lot of examples of what I mean here, and so it's important to just take a look and understand. And also that website that I gave you in the module is going to give you a lot of great examples as well. And you want to make sure that you're matching all of this progress monitoring to the student's language level. And also the parents' language level. You want to make sure that the progress monitoring and all of these documents are in a language that can be understood by the family. When we think about participation in statewide and district assessments, we want to make sure that the student has appropriate accommodations that are based upon their English language proficiency level. And then when we think about transition, we'll talk about transition a little bit later on in the semester, but we want to make sure that a lot of times different cultures have different values that influence those post-secondary expectations. So there's also IEP team considerations. So when you think about the IEP team and who are essential members on the team, it's important to think about the English language learners family. The culture, you want to make sure that one or more of the educators on the team possesses expertise in the learner's native language, so they might be familiar with bilingual education. They are knowledgeable about the family's culture, heritage, and teachings. They understand the stages of English as a second language. Someone should also understand assessment of English language learners and the specific needs there, how to accommodate, things like that. And we want to make sure that their culturally and linguistically responsive instruction is incorporated in the goals and the services and supports that the student is receiving. So in your readings, there's a chapter on academic language. So what is this? It's often referred to as the language of school, but it's much more than the language itself. So it reflects the gestural, behavioral, and cognitive domains that are associated with language. It's really more than the simple language, phrases, and terms that are used in reading, writing, or speaking. So it's important it's really what's going on in school. And it's important to really think about like what is the language level at school versus what is being used at home. And that knowledge of the difference is essential to understanding the achievement gap. So we have students that are, you'll read in chapter 3, there's academic language carriers versus academic language learners. Let's talk a little bit more about the difference between those two. So academic language learners. So those are students that, they do have early and continuous exposure to storytelling at home, rich narrative of personhood and membership. They bring their culture into the classroom. They they do activities after following instructions. So someone tells them what to do and they can follow instructions in order to do that. But all this is done with explicit, direct parenting. So a parent is typically telling them, you need to go brush your teeth after you eat dinner. And it's a dialect that's distinct from the school language. So an academic language learner is a student who is their English language proficiency and the way their language level in English is very different at home versus what's going on at school. Versus a academic language carrier, those are students who, from a family perspective, the family is modeling that same kind of rich language for English learning that is happening at school. So what that looks like is there's a rich vocabulary, there's a literacy as a cultural way of being and acting, so it's just sort of naturally happening at home, just like it is at school. The activities that are requiring organizational problem solving and decision making is really, again, matched what's happening at school. So instead of a parent saying you need to brush your teeth after you eat dinner, the family member might say, what do we need to do after we eat dinner? Oh, and then it gives them the child, the ability to problem solve and think, oh, I got to go brush my teeth. It also reflects on what it means to be a learner. So always kind of stretching yourself, thinking about that. The ability to generalize from the specific. So, giving opportunities to give a whole bunch of detailed information and then summarize it and then what does that all mean? And the dialect skills that are happening at home are similar to the language used in the classroom. So you can see how there's a difference there. And it's important as you're developing an IEP to understand where is the student at. Are they an English academic language carrier or are they still an academic language learner? And it's important to understand that because when you're working with a family, you can help the family understand, like you could see how if you're working with an academic language learner, it's going to be really important to talk with that family about really the strategies and how you're working with the student at school and make sure and help them develop strategies and things like that they can start modeling that at home so that they can ultimately become academic language carriers. And sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes it's going to be more difficult than others. Sometimes the education level of the particular family is such that they may need more support in that area, or maybe their language skills in English are not as very strong, and so it's going to take some additional learning and support for that family in order to get the student to take the English language learning to the next level. So in your readings, we talked about the 4-pronged framework for high quality learning environment. So when we're working with a student who's an English language learner, there's those 4 different components. So social cultural process, developmental process, academics, and cognitive process. So what do we mean by that? We mean for a social cultural, we mean involving building those connections with the students' social, cultural, and world experiences. So it's really like not just teaching them the language, but really bringing in that social cultural perspective into teaching them how to learn English. The academic process is really building on the prior learning experiences of students when the academic language and the learning goals are made explicit. So really just building on where are they at academically and building and developing goals that are progressing. Developmental process is understanding the literacy proficiency level of each student and targeting that instruction a little bit beyond that so that you're still challenging the student, but you're making it attainable and reachable for them. And then cognitively, we think about a higher order thinking skills that are taught intentionally. So like developing those skills about problem solving, how do you take detailed information and summarize it in a way that makes sense. When we think about culturally responsive IEP meetings, I want to give you guys some strategies to think about. So we talked about family professional partnership and the 7 principles. So you can see when we're talking here about things that you can do before, during, and after the meeting, that a lot of these align, and maybe it's just taking it and looking at it in a different way. So before the meeting, you can, it's a good strategy to reflect on your own perspectives on language and culture. What do you need to learn? What do you need to talk to the family about? Are you bringing any of your past perspectives into the meeting that maybe are misunderstandings? How knowledgeable are you about the family's culture and language? Again, you want to learn about the family, and that's something that we learned about with the 7 principles, is understanding kind of where the family is at. So learn about the family, learn about their culture, where are they coming from, and that's going to help you figure out what type of learner you're working with. Consider language preference and making sure, for instance, that you have a translator available if necessary. You want to meet with the learner to talk about how things are going. And you want to make sure there's, like we talked about previously in this PowerPoint, we want to make sure that there's team members on the members of the team that understand English language learners and things like that. You also want to meet with parents ahead of time, find out, are there any issues, like what's going on, how's the year been going with them? And you want to try to provide a rough draft of the IEP document in advance. That's something that we know is a good thing to do for all families, but it's particularly important for families of English language learners, just because it might be more difficult for them to read that document, and it may benefit from being able to ask and take more time with that document to be able to ask those meaningful questions and have that active participation in the meetings. During the meeting, you want to make sure that you're creating an achievable and relevant education plan. You want to make sure that your present levels of performance for the student are developed, and that they're developed in a way that includes strengths, areas of concern, and a preferred way of instruction. And that means where are the students at, and what are making sure that the goals are aligned between their English language learning and special education. You want to make sure that parent and student input is incorporated. You want to make sure that a translator is there if necessary. And it's very important, we talked about this for all students, but it's important to advocate for the student and family. So advocating and understanding their culture and values, and advocating for any needs, both for the student and family. And want to make sure that the cultural and linguistic teaching and perspectives are incorporated both in the IEP and after the IEP and when you're implementing and working with the student. After the meeting, it's important to, for all families, make sure that the progress is monitored and recorded. You continue that collaboration with families, and particularly in following up soon after the meeting, making sure that you're coming up with a communication plan that really makes sense for the family. And you want to make sure that the progress monitoring is documented in culturally responsive ways. So a communication plan that might work for one family is not going to work for another. Data may be misunderstood by some families that in a different way than others, and so it's just really important to make sure you're monitoring that progress and recording it and providing it to the family in a way that makes sense for them. So that's it for today. I just want you to remember, first, the development of an IEP for English language learners requires us to consider additional factors like we talked about. Parent engagement and input is essential. And then it's also very important to ask the student. So if you have any questions, please let me know, and have a great rest of your week.